He's here.
He was here.
I just saw him.
I was going to have him open in prayer, but I'll just open in prayer. How about that?
Great.
Father, we're so grateful for a new day, new mercies, new reminders of your goodness and your grace and your generosity. And we're so thankful for a good breakfast and a new friend and a good speaker and all this amazing research that him and his friends have done that can bless the church and help us think more thoughtfully and strategically about how to love our neighbors and how to engage our neighbors. And so I pray that you would be especially near to Jim as he teaches and be with us. Give us open ears and curious hearts and a deeper willingness to know how to engage and to think and to risk. So we commit this time to you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.
I appreciate that glance you gave me when you said 45 minutes. Look over me. I'll do that. And so, as I said yesterday, last night was very data-driven. Some of you, you love data. Some of you just want to be very practical. Today's the more practical side of it. So what we're going to start out doing is hitting a number of different areas very practically. They're impacted by our study. A lot of this are things that we've been working to implement in our own church. And then the third session is going to go all in on one very important practical thing that is, in my opinion, one of the things the church in the United States would do best to recover if we want to be reaching the unchurched and dechurched, basically the lost around us. So I want to start with the top challenges and priorities for U.S. churches going forward. And the first is the need to embrace both confessional and missional as a framework. Yesterday, the lady in the blonde over there, blonde hair, asked me about attractional churches and how that has impacted the big, kind of Coldplay in a TED Talk kind of church, and how that's impacted dechurching. The way that we think about it, you have these terms confessional and missional. So confessional is what we confess to believe, what we believe to be true, what the Bible is saying. Your confession of faith is the Westminster Confession of Faith. Ours is the, I like to say Second London now, because 1689 has a cultural aspect that I don't feel like defines us. But we have confessions of faith. We have confessions in our creeds. And then, so on one hand, this is let me stay up here. The unfortunate part about this, we've established this kind of tension between we're either going to be confessional or we're going to be missional. So you have these confessional churches, and this is the church that I inherited. We were planted on the campus of RTS Orlando. We're the lone Baptist church that if you're at RTS and you believe that believers only should be baptized, we're the church. But we're still very reformed. And so, there actually was this little bit of sense that we need to prove that we're reformed. So the church went all in on this really reformed route. And the positive was that the theology was buttoned up tight. The negative was when I came in, and to the church's credit, the elders said this: we have not baptized somebody who was not biologically related to us in a decade. And so we had our confession buttoned up really tightly, but the mission was not happening. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have churches that are very missional, and they have lots of people, they're baptizing lots of people, but what they confess to believe is a little unclear. And the negative part on this side is that the ceiling, the spiritual ceiling, just gets lower and lower and lower, because the goal is just to get people in the building. And then you get people who are not Christians. We talked about this a little bit yesterday in terms of the 20th century. People who are not Christians can sit and hear these messages for years and never feel uncomfortable, never feel challenged. That's not good. And many, I don't want to vilify this. I do think the heart of the missional church, I think the heart posture is probably good in most places. But pragmatically, the way that it ends up is the goal, the measurable, is how many people are in seats on Sundays. It doesn't matter if it's a totally different crew. And so there's an element of what you win them with is what you win them to. And if we're winning them with entertainment, that is not going to sustain somebody for the long haul. And so while the front door is wide open, the back door tends to be just as open. And many of these kinds of churches tend to be kind of jumping pads out of the church. And so I'm critiquing my camp as much as I'm critiquing them. And so what we've been trying to instill in our church is that what we confess to believe is inherently missional. It's not a dichotomy. And when you look at the life of Jesus Christ, no one has been more confessional and missional in the history of the world. What he confessed to believe, what he taught was perfect, and no one has been more missional than the one who stepped out of the throne room to come down here, take on flesh, and live and feel what it is that we endure on a daily basis. So first thing we want to do is blow up the idea that confession and mission are mutually exclusive at worst, or that they introduce this inherent tension at best. So we began to teach a class in our adult Sunday school how our confession is missional. We began to think through where are we resisting mission for the sake of being theologically astute. Because those two things, again, they don't have to fight against each other. And so we began to think about how can we be accessible to the lost, like truly accessible without really giving up anything that we confess to believe. So we ended up changing a lot about our worship, our liturgy. We want to be accessible to the lost, but we also, if we could bring one of the church fathers from the very early church, if he could magically learn English and step into our context, the hope is that immediately they would know I'm in a Christian worship. Even if this looks very different, the hope is that, okay, we're doing the Christian things, and that even over the course of 1,800 years, the things that the church is supposed to do would be clear. So really in the beginning was just blowing that tension up, because on our side, there was this kind of badge of honor. It's okay if people aren't flocking to our church as long as we've got our theology buttoned up tight. Well, our theology is not buttoned up tight if we are not reaching the people around us. So I have a whole chapter of that in the book, but that's one of the top priorities and challenges. And I will say I've been hugely encouraged, not just on the confessional side that we have lived in, but on the missional side, seeing attractional churches really rethink who is our main audience, why are we doing what we're doing, how do we know and love the people who are coming to our church. It's been hugely encouraging, and as they've moved toward us, I've actually found there's a lot of areas that I've been able to learn from them. If you want in Q&A, we can talk about music. We've been making a lot of musical changes in our church that I'm excited about, but I have to punt that to Q&A because I don't have time in my 45 minutes. Number 2, we need to return to the hard work of evangelism and discipleship. If any of you were involved in a church plant, I'm going to say late 90s to circa 2010, you benefited from Christian, of course you were 2008, is that right? 2006, so you're in this range. Churches that were planted in those time periods benefited from Christian transfer growth because they were doing biblical things that were new to certain areas. So it could be, expository preaching, a focus on membership, revival of Reformed theology, contemporary worship. There are a lot of things that are biblically acceptable that had not been done in these areas. And so there were a lot of Christians that would flock to these new church plants. Well, you fast forward to now nobody's doing anything new. And if they are, it's probably out of bounds. And so what has happened over the past 25 years, it's created this unrealistic expectation of church planting that if you don't have 200 people and you're not self-sufficient within 2 to 3 years, you're doing something wrong. We want to get rid of that mindset completely, because what's happening is church planting is returning to the hard work of evangelism and discipleship that it has always been and is still in many parts of the world. And so as Christians, we really need to think about how we look at our church planters, how we resource our church planters, but then even how we think through, yes, there's some things organizationally and experientially that we might need to refine, but at the core, the hard, fruitful work is evangelism and discipleship. And so how do we as a church do that, and how do we free our church planters to be doing more of that? That's number 2. Number 3, I addressed this stat yesterday, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just saying there are many more churches closing now than opening. And the last stat, 2019, this is the Lifeway study, 1,500 more churches closed than opened. That was pre-COVID. The study has not been done again since then, and every indication says that number is at least double, if not more, now. All right, this is something that I started talking about after I wrote the book. I am convinced it's going to be harder for medium-sized churches, about 150 to 300, going forward. There's going to be a hollowing out in cities of medium-sized churches. This is a real problem. So economically, it is viable for churches under the 150 mark, generally speaking, because they're more flexible, they're more nimble, especially under 100 people. You can meet in various places. You don't have a lot of children's needs, things like that. So under 100 people, those churches economically are going to be okay in the United States. Once you get above around 400 people, you generally have the resources to be able to hire who you want, to deal with children, to have a facility. But things are becoming so expensive in cities in the United States that when you get into this 150 to 300 realm and you want a pastor who's been trained, that pastor has children. Increasingly, I'm not making there's more of a burden to help those pastors educate their children the way that they want to, and that might cost more money. That you need a space that can accommodate that many people. There are just a lot of factors in that middle realm that, generally speaking, 150 to 300 people can't support. Now, why is this a problem? Because the 150 to 300 range, in my opinion, is really a sweet spot for churches. We talked yesterday about Tim Keller saying not to moralize different sized churches. I don't want to moralize it, but I just want to recognize the value of a church that is organized enough to be able to really impact a city, and they're part of a city, and a church that still really knows each other and has genuine friendships. People will know if you stop coming, if something happens, you're going to be taken care of. If we are losing this 150 to 300 person sized church in the United States, we will feel it. This is a really significant challenge, in my opinion, coming down the pike. Number 5, because of what I said about returning to the hard work of evangelism and discipleship, the way that we think through church planting, we're going to need to resource and fund these church plants longer than the historic 3 to 5 year gap. We've been asking our church planters to start the church, win the lost, raise all the money, all at the same time. And because they've benefited from Christian transfer growth, that's worked. Now that church plants do not benefit as much from Christian transfer growth, we need to free up the leaders of that church to be able to be doing evangelism and discipleship, and that is probably going to mean longer-term funding for these church plants. There's some questions, I've got thoughts on the vibe shift going on right now. Are y'all familiar with the term vibe shift? There's post-Biden, now Trump. There is more freedom. So in the era of Biden, will public schools and other public spaces remain hospitable to churches? Those are real questions. They're not as much questions at the current moment because there is, on the positive, there's more freedom to... Generally speaking, local municipalities will impact this, but there's more freedom to be able to use public facilities for things like church plants and church events. I digress just a little bit. I'm nervous about the vibe shift at the same time because I do see the Bible and Christianity being used for for power, for influence, for money. Not everyone, but in ways that I think are going to create actually larger issues for us down the line than we experienced even 4 years ago. I'm not getting political. I'm just talking about the Christian landscape. So that's something. Number 7, seminaries are reporting fewer students training to be senior pastors or church planters. I've had a number of long discussions with Ligon Duncan about this, the chancellor of RTS. And while RTS is doing well in terms of, and are y'all I'm just making an assumption here that most of y'all are familiar with Reformed Theological Seminary, but most seminaries are declining rapidly in number of students, while RTS is not. What they've noticed is that the number of students who come in wanting to be a senior pastor or a church planter, that is radically dropping. And we have a lot of thoughts as to why I may be just getting old and saying there may be some generational issues at hand here, but I also look at like the time period that a lot of these students were in high school and college and observing churches was one of the most tense seasons that we've experienced. And so I wonder how much that's just impacted what they view. And so as a result, the burden of the church to disciple high schoolers and college students that may have a call to ministry and cast a vision for being a senior pastor or a church planter, not right out of college, but in the long term with the right training, is going to be a real thing that churches need to do so that we can set up the next generation of pastors well. I've got a lot more thoughts on next generation of pastors if we want to go there in Q&A. But I think the churches need to, the era of being able to outsource the burden for the next generation of pastors to seminaries alone is done, and the church needs to step it up. I see all these, you see articles semi-often about people saying what I didn't learn in seminary. And I look at these lists and I was like, these are not the things that seminaries are supposed to teach you. This is what the church is for. Like it might as well be labeled what the church didn't teach me. That would be appropriate. But the burden of the next generation of pastors and church leaders is a burden that the church carries. And just to begin to acknowledge that and think through what is, each of us, our local churches, what is our small but significant contribution to the next generation of pastors. In many places, there is, in almost all places, there is, if you look at the age range of current pastors, it's largely older men and depending on denominations, women who are aging out, and we do not have the supply to replace them at a large scale. Now, maybe you and I would say some of these churches don't need to be replaced, and there needs to be moving on. That's another conversation, but it's still an issue that we need to grapple with. Number 8, engaging the 3 life stages between 13 and 30. So we started talking about off-ramps. The off-ramp at 13, the off-ramp at 18, and the off-ramp at 30. So 13, they're getting into late middle, early high school. They're becoming their own person. That's a time when children leave the church. 18, they're leaving their parents' houses. They're going to college. That is an off-ramp. 30 is actually a really significant off-ramp as well because they're establishing their careers, choosing who they're going to marry. They're having kids, deciding if they're going to go to church or not. And so we used to describe them as off-ramps. After this next round of research that Michael Graham and Ryan Burge have done, that I can only minimally talk about, I've stopped calling them off-ramps, and I've started looking at them more as opportunities. Because a better way to say this is what they are at 13, they are likely to retain to 18. And what they are like at 18, they are likely to retain until 30. And so I've begun to see that this is more encouraging than I realized. If we invest well as a community at 13, things are statistically speaking very likely to go well to 18. Then if we have invested well at 18, it's way more statistically likely that it's going to go well after that. And then there's a whole lot between 18 and 30 that depends on the church itself. And some churches are around more young professionals or people establishing their post-high school, post-college lives. I say post-high school without college, or post-college lives, young professional lives. And so there's some unique opportunities with churches in that age range. Our context is more, right now, our church is focusing on the age 1 to 18, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Number 9, discipleship that reinforces God's design for embodied worship and substantive membership. We were made to worship together. Like I'm going to talk a little more about, again, great question from the young lady in the blonde. What is her name? Ellis had some great questions. We were made to be together. We were made to sing together, to pray together, to consider God's word together, to bear one another's burdens. And that doesn't happen unless we're coming together. And we're going to talk more about some things that we learned about the benefits of just being together on a weekly basis. But biblically speaking, we don't need the data to know that this is what God has not just called us to do, but given us the opportunity to participate in. So when we talk about the phrase online worship, we're going to talk about online in just a little bit. I'm not trying to vilify the internet, but I do want to say that to like Paul and Luke would be an absolute oxymoron. How I think they would be like, how would you even do that? Like, how would you worship? In terms of corporate worship, how would you do that alone? We were made to be together. And so in our context, I began about 4 years ago to really, in my preaching and my teaching, to talk about the good that God has for us in coming together and worshiping. Not just the requirement that he has made, don't neglect the gathering, but the good that he has for those who do obey that command. And I think that's really important. Membership is something in a PCA church I don't have to push on a lot, but I think it's really important, regardless of the size of the church, that there are structures in place where everybody in the church can be prayed for substantively, where you're substantively known in some way that if things are not going well, the leadership, the elders, the deacons are going to be able to jump into your lives. If you go back again to the early church, the idea that somebody would just pop in and out and never be seen, never be known, not be able to be taken care of is just unheard of. Now, some of that is on the person, admittedly, but the structures of our church should minimize the ability to do that. So I think really prioritizing worshiping together on a weekly basis and promoting substantive membership is going to be something that is really going to seem, as normal as it seems for us, it is going to seem counterculture in a really sweet way to a lot of the people that live around this church. Number 10, substantively connecting Christians who relocate to a gospel-centered church. If moving is the number one reason for dechurching, then every time someone in our church moves, we look at that as like all warning lights going off. How can we help them connect to a church wherever it is that they're moving? And it's easier now than ever. I mean, you may have personal friendships, but there are websites that can help you make suggestions to people. And then, in terms of leadership and friends of those people, what does it look like to follow up with them after 60 days, 90 days, 180 days, to be able to ask, have you connected yet? Connecting a little bit more to online resources. It's not uncommon for someone who loves their church to move away and just keep listening to the pastor, the sermons of the pastor that they left. I'm not saying that's a bad thing to listen, but if it comes at the expense of finding a new church family, that's a bad thing. It will hinder people's walks with the Lord. And I do think we've seen a little uptick in this. Not I'm not necessarily just saying from like our research, but the resources that we have, I know that we practice this when people are leaving, but increasingly we're seeing people show up to church and they're saying, yeah, I moved from this place, and our pastors were trying to help us find a church. You were on the list. And what I've not done well, but increasingly what I want to do is every time I hear that, and if they do join, I want to send an email or a letter to that pastor just saying thank you for your investment, because humanly speaking, financially, whatever, we get nothing from helping people leaving find a new church. But in terms of kingdom impact, it really makes a huge difference. So that's number 10. Number 11, a general unpreparedness or unwillingness to embrace an exilic posture. This is another interesting, touchy one in the vibe shift, but as Christians, we live in exile. Like, our home is not here. Now, yes, we are to pray that we can live quiet, godly lives so that the gospel can flourish. That's a good thing. But this is not our home. And we felt it probably more between 2020 and 2024, given some cultural aspects to it. And in that season, there was a fear. Like, in that season, we didn't embrace our exilic posture because we were living out of a posture of fear. If this country doesn't go the way we want, what does it mean for our church, for our children, for our grandchildren? And those are good questions to be concerned with. But when there's fundamentally a fear-based foundation to that, what that is a lack of acknowledgement that this isn't our home. We shouldn't expect that it is going to go the way that we want. And we should have confidence if we look at, the law. We can go to Adam and Eve, to Abraham, to the Israelites. We can go to the early church. Peter addresses it to the exiles. He's writing to exiles, those who were called and exiled. And so we should know, even just by looking at our current state around the globe, the global state, that there are millions and millions and millions of Christians who are living in much worse political environments than we are. And so when the book came out in the beginning, we were kind of talking about what does it look like to disciple our people to be able to embrace an exilic posture. Now it's kind of shifted as many people feel like they're getting more of what they want in some ways, trying to understand that, okay, your hope is not in this. And again, this could be a Q&A thing, but the way things are, even the people who like what's going on the most in terms of the freedoms that are being opened up, because of the way they're being opened up, we're poised for when there's a switch in the White House one day for a radical, whiplash going the other way. Again, I'm not getting super political. I hope that's heard. I'm just stating that I'm stating the changes that we've experienced, the changes that we could very likely experience in the future, and the need to disciple our people that we're okay. We are exiles. Our citizenship is in heaven, and God is going to protect us no matter what it is that's going on around us. That is something that has been very lost in especially the Christian culture in the United States over the past, really post-World War II Christian culture. All right, so that takes us to a different question. What is it that can be done? First, hold firm to historic Christianity. Every data point says if you let go of historic Nicene Creed Christianity, you die. It may be one generation, two, depending on money, endowments, building, things like that, you will die. If I wasn't a Christian, didn't care anything about what the Bible said, and I just wanted to go and plant a church that's going to work, I would I would plant a church that holds to the Nicene Creed and a traditional understanding of sexuality and marriage. Just, if I didn't care at all about the Bible, statistically speaking, that's what works. Now, biblically speaking, it works because it's a design. But the temptation, and I don't expect this temptation, when I speak in other more progressive contexts, I'll harp on this more. But let me just encourage and remind you that holding true to the historic gospel, not only, more importantly, is biblical. This is what God has for us. But if it's any encouragement, statistically speaking, we let go of that and we're done. Number 2, what can be done? Invest in 13 to 18-year-olds. So this is that middle realm. And I honestly don't know whether I'm wearing my pastor hat or my dad hat when I talk about it. I have 3 teenagers and an 11-year-old. And when my oldest, who's now 18, when he was a freshman, a freshman in high school, I told my wife, he was the only high school boy in our church. And I told my wife, like, listen, if he wants to go to another youth group at some point, fine. Like, I mean, I just want him to love Jesus. But at the same time, I was like, let's pray about this. Let's really look at what it looks like to invest in the next generation, to invest in staff, to invest in volunteers. And God has blessed that prolifically. And the reason that I think it is, like, on the back end of that, here's why I am so thankful for a larger community of 13 to 18, but also a larger community of people investing in that age group. I saw an atheist psychologist, a reel, and I wish that I could find this again to be able to quote this person, but this atheist psychologist was saying, because of evolution, our children are wired to leave the home, and because of that, the wiring is going to say, between the ages of about 13 and 25, don't listen to your parents. And his conclusion was, this is why we need other people saying the same things to our children. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, okay, I disagree with how you got there, but I really like where you got. Biblically, we would say that God's design is that children would leave the home. That design was marred by sin. Yes, we even know scientifically there's some ways that we can see that children are less inclined to listen to their parents between those ages. And so it is incredibly important to have other people saying the same things to our children. I say something, I might, on a good day, get an eye roll from some of my kids. Our youth director or volunteers say the same thing. They're the wisest people who have ever walked the earth. But just trying to figure out, what does it look like to not just establish this cool youth thing over there, but a truly intergenerational opportunity to interact with the next generation. So again, I don't know if I'm speaking more as a pastor or a dad, but I'm excited either in whichever hat I have on. I can tell you this has been just a tremendous blessing to the children in our church, and something that the entire church has for the most part rallied behind. Learn from the back door. We need to be able to, when people leave our church, we need to be able to understand why. The truth is our friend. We don't want to always understand, give people who are leaving, especially if they're leaving with bitterness or anger, to give them the platform to be able to speak to the leadership. But we have learned so much from increasingly listening to people who were leaving our church. And let me tell you, in 2020 to 2022, we lost 60% of our membership making some of these changes, and it was brutal. I don't have time to go through it, but I can, I guess, in Q&A. But if the church is a sink, you had a faucet and a drain, both were wide open. But by God's grace, the water level stayed the same, and then somewhere around 22, that drain shut. We were intentionally trying to make some of these changes, and learning from the back door, there were some things that we heard that we need to address that, we need to change that. But then other things were like, okay, they shouldn't have that opinion. Why? What are our deficiencies in terms of how we lead and teach that have allowed that opinion not only to fester with one person, but to grow in terms of other people? So it really calls us to think through, what are we teaching, how, and not just write them off as they leave. Develop substantive membership. I'm not going to harp too much on that in this context. I've talked about it a little bit already. Relationships, I talked about yesterday. Relationships. Relationships for believers between believers, relationships between older generations, young generations, relationships between believers and unbelievers. Everything that we see in the data is going to reinforce what we already understand scripturally in that area. Number 6, know where people are at risk of dechurching. This is the back door, people in the church. So when people move, when people become a single parent, when people lose their jobs, if there is some terrible, if somebody's exposed to abuse, racism, misogyny, all of these things should be on our radar. This person is now at greater risk of dechurching. And so how do we identify them, and how do we make sure they get the care that they need? That's knowing when the risks are there on the back door. Then you have the front door. Knowing the dechurched on the outside, and how do we connect with them to be able to help bring them back in the front door? A lot of that is what I talked about yesterday, especially with the low-hanging fruit of the mainstream, the dechurched mainstream evangelicals, the 4 questions, but really being able to talk with people, understand, are they dechurched? If they are, which category do you fall in? And given their category, do they need a nudge? Do they need to be at our table? Or do they need to be in our lives for a really long time? And I will say, if there has been abuse of any kind, I am not going to invite that person into our front doors very quickly. I'm going to try and understand their story. This is going to be more of what we talk about next time. I am going to invite them into small groups, and I am to give them every opportunity when they're ready to sit down with our leadership before they ever worship and ask hard questions. Why what they experienced somewhere else is less likely to happen here. Not that we're perfect, but how can the leadership affirm you should have left that church? But you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we're here and we're not them. Oh, I made it so far without all right. Find creative ways to use our buildings. I mean, you have there's so many ways to do this. I talked yesterday about dying churches, allowing church plants. There are churches that get creative to bring the community in during the week. You may already do that. I don't know. But you have a great location here. Maybe I'm just thinking off the top of my head, finding an old Sears distribution center and planting a church in it. Something like that. But just we need to not just have these buildings that we don't. Let me state the positive. There are opportunities to use our buildings to engage those outside it in ways that the church in the 20th century historically has not done. Be intentional with your digital footprint. Okay. This is where I'm going to get to Ellis's question. We've had to really think through how we approach our online presence. There is no question. Our online presence is our front door. Yours probably is too. And they're going to look at what we believe, where we are, who we are, sermons, things like that. But in 2020, when we, along with everybody else, was live streaming in the middle of COVID, on the back of that, we decided no more live stream. We do not live stream anymore. This is my most controversial opinion. So most people that I talk to don't take my position, and there are ways to, and that's okay. You don't have to. But the principle is, how do we communicate to our people that embodied worship is what we're here for? And so, we took our, I remember there was an elder in the church, and I was like, hey, missed you on Sunday, what's going on? Or he was an elder candidate, and he said, oh, I just was tired. It's easier to turn on the TV. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. And we still upload sermons. It's on Monday or Tuesday. And our sermon uploads aren't that great right now. We're trying to even think through how to make our front door better. But we're not going to live stream because we don't want to communicate that is a substitute. Now, when you have shut-ins, that's another question. That's the most compelling group for me, and I've got thoughts on that. But I do think there are some real ways for our online presence to be a benefit, both in terms of like what are we communicating about the value of Sunday. And I will say when we shut it off, our attendance went up. But in any case, I do, when I was a little more cynical about online worship than I am now, believe it or not, I heard about somebody, some big name doing meta church where, you're fully immersed. And I was like, oh my goodness, where have we gone? What's going on? And the church staff were in the room, and there was this one guy, they kept poking, and he wouldn't respond. He kept poking, and they wouldn't respond. And he pulled out a sparkler and wrote China with the sparkler. The sparkler was not yet monitorable by the Chinese government, and that person was able to have access to Christian teaching in a way that he couldn't where he was. So then I was like, I'm a terrible person. There's so many opportunities here. But just being principled, that's the better way. Being principled with how we think about our online presence as a front door, as a way for people to have access to our teaching, but also as a way to reinforce what we're called to be and do as an embodied church. Mental health, we need to take very seriously. I'm going to try and go very quickly, but the mental health statistics of the dechurched are crazy. The dechurched people, the anxiety, depression, loneliness, and suicidal ideation went off the charts when they left church. And what was fascinating, there's a Harvard study by a man named Tyler Vanderweel in the book, and he did this study. It wasn't necessarily Christian, and it had nothing to do with what you believe, but he looked at the mental health of people who went to a house of worship on a weekly basis, not monthly, but weekly. And the mental health benefits of going to worship with other people on a weekly basis, according to this study, were so significant, not only in all those areas of mental health, but also in terms of physical health. It was the equivalent of stopping smoking, going from smoking a pack of cigarettes a day to not. And so he concluded that doctors need to diagnose or prescribe people go worship on a weekly basis. And he's not a Christian. And so there are significant mental health needs. There are non-Christian studies showing the benefit of doing what God has told us to do. I'm not trying to be blasphemous here. Even if we weren't preaching the gospel or doing something Christian, there are benefits to it. There are greater benefits by far when we come together in a Christian setting and worship. And I would say because it's a part of what God has designed us to do. So we're in our context, we've been trying to foster better relationships between clergy and licensed mental health counselors, forums, public forums between pastors and counselors for our people to understand it better, develop lists of trusted counselors with competencies that we share between churches so that we can have the best resources for our people. Embrace an exilic posture. I've already talked about that. There is a free tool that you can use if you want, but we have this audit at dechurching.com that churches can go through and have resources to kind of grade where might we need to invest. It's not, it just kind of helps point churches towards where are the greater points of opportunities for us. And then lastly, this is going to be the next talk, and I'm 45 minutes exactly. I'm so proud of myself. In the book, I said the evangelist of the future is going to look more like a counselor than an apologist. And that phrase in the book has stuck with me, and it is something that have been really excited to develop, implement increasingly in my own context, and that's going to be what our final session is on. Great.
All right, why don't we take 13 minutes, do whatever you need to do, and we'll come back to starting at 10:30. Sound good? Jim, you need anything? Food?
I'm good. Thank you.